Salam, peace be upon you. My name is Muhammad Layak Siddiqui, the father of holophase. We began by placing pattern before object and taking phi as circular comparability, so only differences made through declared windows are public. Every claim must declare type, scope, assumptions, and provenance, while pattern, claim, certificate, and artifact remain distinct. We learned local reading through lifts, the carrier A equals d phi tilde, and finite signatures through jets, with cadence, texture, and flow as three readable faces. Boundaries, domains, excisions, stitching, winding, holonomy, and defects became part of identity. We rebuilt persistence, null, interaction, composition, constraints, dynamics, adjacency, conservation, generation, stochasticity, derived readouts, expressed physics, and observer closure. Part 32.5, the measurement certification loop. There is a quiet mistake that sits beneath many pictures of science, and once we see it clearly, an entire fog begins to lift. The mistake is this. We imagine that measurement comes first and certification comes after. We imagine that first we simply look, record, and gather raw facts, and only later do we check, interpret, evaluate, and certify. In this picture, measurement is the ground floor, and certification is an upper floor built later. But this picture is false. Measurement and certification do not stand in a line. They stand in a loop. That loop is what this part makes explicit. The core claim is simple. Measurement and certification form one indissoluble public cycle. Measurement produces traces through windows. Certification turns those traces into public reusable structure. Prior certifications stabilize the very windows, instruments, standards, and comparison habits that make future measurements possible. Observers and communities maintain this cycle over time. So neither side is primitive. Measurement without certification is blind. Certification without measurement is empty. Science does not begin from a first pure observation. It inherits an already running wheel. That is the deep lesson of this part. The first crack in the old story. Let us begin with something so ordinary that it almost disappears from view. A child places a ruler beside the table and says, "The table is 1 meter long." That sounds immediate. It sounds like pure measurement. But the moment we slow down, the simplicity breaks apart. What is a ruler? What is a meter? Why do the marks on the ruler count? Why do we trust the ruler not to be stretched? Why do we place it along the edge and not diagonally? Why do we begin reading from zero? Why do we think the child's eye is reading correctly? Why do we believe this act belongs to a public method rather than private guesswork? Suddenly, the simple measurement is sitting on top of a whole civilization. There are prior standards, prior units, prior calibrations, prior teaching, prior correction habits, prior trust networks, prior certified artifacts. The child is not beginning from nothing. The measurement is already supported by an inherited structure. That is the first insight. No public measurement comes from nowhere. Every measurement presupposes prior certification. And equally, no certification could ever have arisen without earlier traces, earlier comparisons, earlier measurements. That is why the relation is recursive. The bootstrap problem. Once we notice this, a deeper problem appears. If measurement depends on prior certification, then how did certification begin? And if certification depends on measurement traces, then how did measurement begin? It can sound like a paradox. If one needs the other, How can either start? But the answer is not that one side secretly stands first. The answer is that public knowledge is not a ladder with a first rung. It is a loop that is always already operating at some inherited level. This is the bootstrap problem in its honest form. We do not solve it by finding a mythical first measurement. We solve it by recognizing that science lives in recursive continuity. Every present act of measurement inherits earlier certified windows. Every present act of certification inherits earlier trace practices. We never begin from absolute zero. We begin from a running method that can be refined, corrected, widened, tightened, and sometimes partially rebuilt, but never conjured from nothing. This is not weakness, it is maturity. The kitchen teaches the loop. The kitchen is often a better teacher than a textbook. Imagine we are learning to bake bread. At first, we scoop flour carelessly. One loaf rises well, another is dense, a third collapses. The recipe feels unreliable. Then we change something. We stop measuring flour by eye and begin weighing it on a scale. Now the result improves. But what happened here? We did not merely measure better. We entered a loop. The scale already presupposed prior certification. Its markings were standardized. Its 0 point was tested. Its unit system was inherited. Our reading habits were taught. And our trust in its tolerance came from earlier validation. Then, that certified instrument produced traces: 500 grams of flour, 32 degrees of water, 60 minutes of proofing. Then the loaf outcome fed back into future practice. We refined the recipe, trusted some measurements more, rejected others, tightened the acceptable range, changed future windows of attention. So measurement produced traces. Certification turned those traces into reusable knowledge. That knowledge then reshaped later measurement. That is the loop. The kitchen is already science when it becomes disciplined. We can now state the cycle cleanly. Pattern interaction produces traces. Traces become evidence through certification. Certification stabilizes windows, units, procedures, and trust. Those stabilized structures make future measurement possible. Observers maintain continuity through memory, practice, and correction. Then the cycle repeats. In compressed form, interaction, trace, certification, stabilized method, improved interaction. That is the measurement certification loop. It is not decorative philosophy. It is the engine of public knowledge. Why measurement without certification is blind? Suppose a camera photographs the sky. The image exists. It is a trace. But what is it a trace of? A planet, a sensor artifact, a hot pixel, a reflection, a distant aircraft, a processing error. Without certification, the trace is blind. It has no typed public status. It has not yet passed through declared windows, declared calibration, declared provenance, declared scope, and declared refusal rules. This is true everywhere. A line in a detector is not yet a particle event. A blot on a slide is not yet a disease marker. A number from a sensor is not yet a temperature claim. A bruise is not yet proof of a cause. Measurement by itself creates marks. It does not yet create public knowledge. That is why measurement without certification is blind. The blindness is not in the instrument. The blindness is in the missing path from trace to justified public claim. Why certification without measurement is empty. Now take the opposite failure. Suppose someone writes a beautiful report. The language is clean, the confidence is high, the statistics look smooth, and the conclusion sounds impressive. But there are no traces, no raw records, no logs, no images, no spectra, no samples, no calibration files, no timestamps, no provenance chain. Then the certification is empty. It is judgment without contact. It is a court verdict without a case file, a diagnosis without a scan or test, a map without any survey, a memory without a witness. Certification cannot create public reality by declaration. It can only stabilize, constrain, and validate what traces lawfully support. That is why certification without measurement is empty. So the loop is necessary in both directions. Measurement rescues certification from emptiness. Certification rescues measurement from blindness. Windows live inside the loop. Earlier, we learned that every claim comes through a declared window. Now we see something deeper. Windows are not primitive openings, they are products of the loop. A thermometer is a certified window into thermal interaction. A telescope is a certified window into distant light. A microscope is a certified window into small-scale structure. A survey is a certified social window. A transform in mathematics can even act like a window, making one pattern legible through another representation. But no window begins trustworthy. Every trustworthy window is a historical achievement, built, tuned, calibrated, compared, corrected, and inherited. This is why the loop matters so much. Measurement uses windows. Certification stabilizes windows. Stable windows enable new measurement. New measurement sometimes forces window revision. So windows are not just passive portals. They are living products of recursive public discipline. The observer as loop maintainer. Part 32 naturalized the observer. Now Part 32.5 gives the observer a sharper role. The observer is the local maintainer of the loop. An observer maintains the loop by carrying memory of prior traces, applying inherited certified procedures, generating new traces, comparing them with past expectations, updating internal models, adjusting windows, and preserving continuity across time. This is true at many scales. A person can do it, a laboratory can do it, a hospital can do it, a scientific community can do it across generations. The observer is not a detached witness. The observer is part of the machinery that keeps public knowledge from collapsing. That is why persistence matters so much. An observer must persist enough to connect earlier traces to later ones. Without persistence, there is no loop, only isolated marks. Hospitals, weather offices, and navigation systems. We can make this even clearer through institutions. A hospital is not just a building full of machines. It is a loop maintaining observer pattern. Tests produce traces, blood results, imaging data, heart rate curves, temperature records. Certification turns those into diagnosis, treatment plans, and risk assessments. Those certifications then reshape future measurements. What tests to repeat, what thresholds to watch, what instruments to calibrate, what symptoms to prioritize. A weather office is the same. Sensors and satellites produce traces. Forecast models and calibrated procedures certify them into predictions. Those predictions shape where we look next and how we refine the models. A navigation system is the same. Signals produce location traces. Algorithms certify route estimates. Certified routes guide future signal use and map updates. Across scales, the same architecture appears. The loop is not a philosopher's invention. It is how working systems actually know. The myth of raw data. There is another illusion we must break here: the myth of raw data. People say the raw data speaks for itself, but almost no public trace is truly raw. The choice of sensor is already a decision. The sampling rate is already a decision. The thresholding is already a decision. The file format is already a decision. The cleaning pipeline is already a decision. The choice of what counts as noise is already a decision. So every trace arrives already shaped by prior method. This does not mean data is fake. It means that access is a structure. And once we admit that, the loop becomes unavoidable. Traces depend on inherited method. An inherited method depends on earlier traces. There is no pure starting point outside the cycle. Provenance is loop memory made public. Part 28.5 made provenance first class. Here we can now say why. Provenance is the memory of the loop made visible. When a claim carries provenance, it tells us what traces fed it, which transformations processed those traces, what tool change shaped them, what parameters mattered, what selection choices entered, what prior certifications it inherited. Without provenance, the loop suffers amnesia. A result can still look convincing, but its public continuity is broken. It cannot be replayed properly. Correction becomes guesswork. Revocation cannot propagate. Method history vanishes. So provenance is not administrative decoration. It is what keeps the recursive engine from forgetting itself. Public reproducibility lives inside the loop. Reproducibility is not a separate virtue floating beside science. Reproducibility is one of the natural outputs of a healthy loop. If windows are declared, traces are typed, provenance is intact, instruments are calibrated, procedures are stable, and certification rules are explicit, then other observers can re-enter the loop and see whether comparable traces arise. When reproducibility fails, it does not always mean the original claim was false. It may mean the loop was underspecified, the window changed, the instrument drifted, hidden boundary conditions differed, the sample type shifted, the processing pipeline was opaque, the observer role was never fully declared. So reproducibility crises are often really loop crises. Why correction is possible at all? Once we see the loop, correction stops looking like embarrassment and starts looking like health. If a claim later fails, that failure travels through the loop. Backward, into traces, into instruments, into calibration histories, into selection decisions, into window assumptions. Forward, into future methods, into updated standards, into revised thresholds, into new refusal rules. A living loop corrects because it carries memory. A dead doctrine cannot correct, it can only defend itself. So correction is proof that the loop is active. The gates of this part. Now we install the rigor layer. Loop integrity gate. A claim invoking the loop must specify how continuity is maintained. Where is the memory? How are methods transmitted? How are standards stabilized? How are corrections propagated? Trace to certification gate. A trace must have a declared path to public use. What trace was produced? What checks were applied? What claim type emerged? What would block certification? Certification to window gate. Every certification must shape future access somehow. What windows are stabilized? What calibrations are updated? What later measurements become possible or restricted? Gate. No claim may pretend to arise from nowhere. Every measurement presupposes inherited standards, tools, or practices. Every certification presupposes inherited trace grammar. These gates prevent mythology from re-entering through method language. Firewalls against method amnesia. This part blocks several dangerous moves. We block the myth of first measurement. We block certificate without trace. We block trace without certification pathway. We block observer as detached witness. We block method amnesia. We block self-grounding certification. We block the fantasy that science starts fresh each time. These are not small mistakes, they are structural collapses. If a community keeps conclusions but forgets the traces, it becomes doctrinal. If it keeps traces but forgets the certification pathways, it becomes archival chaos. If it keeps both but forgets the observer's role in maintaining standards, it drifts silently. The loop is what prevents all three. A courtroom analogy. A courtroom makes this vivid. A fingerprint on glass is a trace, but by itself, it is not public legal evidence. It becomes evidence only through chain of custody, comparison standards, known error rates, declared methods, trained examiners, and legal scope. That is certification. Then the certified use of fingerprints changes future investigation. Officers collect differently. Labs archive differently. Training changes. Standards tighten. That is the feedback from certification to future measurement. So even law, when public and disciplined, runs on the same loop. Trace, certification, future method refinement. Science is not unique in having the loop. Science is unique in making the loop explicit and continuously improvable. The observer community as a higher order pattern. One person can run a tiny loop, but public science is a much larger observer pattern. People, instruments, archives, reference standards, journals, training systems, replication networks, correction procedures. Together, they form a distributed pattern that maintains knowledge across time. This is why civilization matters epistemically. A laboratory notebook is part of the observer. A calibration center is part of the observer. A refusal archive is part of the observer. A standards institute is part of the observer. At this larger scale, observer closure becomes civilizational closure. The public knower is not a private mind, but a distributed Phi pattern. What this part installs. By the end of part 32.5, we have installed measurement certification recursion, bootstrap honesty, the public knowledge cycle, asterisk observer as loop maintainer, asterisk and a direct bridge to a proper definition of measurement. We now understand that measurement and certification are not detachable modules. They are one recursive infrastructure. This changes the entire tone of science. We no longer imagine that science stands on pure observation. We no longer imagine that science stands on pure theory. We see instead a living wheel. Trace, certification, memory, refinement, trace again. Refusal conditions. We refuse if trace and certification are severed. Prior measurement infrastructure is denied. Certification is presented as self-grounding. Observer continuity is erased. Method history is hidden. Or the loop is broken without declaration. Refusal here is not negativity, it is loop protection. It keeps public knowledge from becoming mythology. Final image, the mill wheel. We can close with one simple image. A village mill stands beside the river. Water strikes the wheel. The wheel turns the stone grinds grain, the flour feeds the village repairs the wheel, clears the channel, sharpens the stone, and keeps the axle true. Then the water strikes again. Measurement is the water striking the wheel. Contact, trace, change. Certification is the milling structure that turns motion into usable flour. Past maintenance makes future turning possible. Future turning justifies past maintenance. There is no first turn in a living village. There is inherited turning, maintained turning, corrected turning, improved turning. That is the measurement certification loop. And now, with the loop fully visible, we are finally ready to define measurement properly. Not as mystical seeing, not as primitive contact, but as certified Phi pattern interaction that produces a trace inside a declared window within a running public knowledge cycle. That is the next part. Part 33. Measurement as certified Phi pattern interaction. Always peace be upon you.